Welcome to Your Lettings Journey, a brand new podcast that's essential listening for landlords with property in North London. Now, everyone will have their own unique landlord journey, from the way they get into property to the way they hang up or pass on their keys, and then all the different decisions in between. But along the way, we're all faced by many of the same issues and potential pitfalls. I'm Rachel.
And I'm Ramesh, and together we have a lifetime of experience as landlords, letting agents and tenants that we want to share with you to help you navigate your lettings journey.
So if you're an experienced landlord wanting to make sure that you're keeping on the right side of all the rules and regulations, or if you're completely new to this game and don't know where to start, then this is the podcast for you.
Your Lettings Journey is produced by Belvoir, Enfield and Central Housing Group. For more information, visit belvoir.co.uk/Enfield and centralhousinggroup.com.
Did you know that by not having specific landlord's insurance, but having standard buildings insurance, you could be invalidating your mortgage? Or that if you have the wrong insurance, or if you undervalue your property, or if you even have the wrong type of tenancy, that it could cost you a small fortune if something bad happens? This week on Your Lettings Journey, I'm joined by our first guest, Simon Bishop. Simon is the Senior Customer Development Manager at Let Alliance, and he's here to explain all things landlord insurance. I hope you enjoy. Okay, so Simon, thank you very much for coming on to Your Lettings Journey. First off, insurance. Now, most people don't think insurance is generally terribly exciting, so they're probably all tuned off now. But you have been in insurance for a very long time, and there's obviously something that keeps you there. So please tell us a little bit about yourself and why you are in insurance.
Yeah, so I'll give you a bit of a start journey of me working here at Let Alliance. So I started here just under 9 years ago. I was working in the referencing department, became a team leader, then moved over to the sort of the sales side of things. Did a little bit of tenants insurance, and then kind of fell in love with the landlord's insurance side of things. And like you said, it's not the most exotic of loves, I suppose, but it's very varied. It's really interesting. I find it very interesting. Not every policy is the same. Not every client's the same. You can tailor things to specific needs. It just gives you a really good chance to have a chat with so many different people as well, which I find fascinating, if I'm going to be completely honest with you.
Okay. I did tell a friend of mine that we were going to be having this conversation this week, and he said to me, "Oh, wonderful, an estate agent and an insurance salesman, that's going to be riveting." So we have to make it really exciting.
I know, yeah.
I'm not sure who was coming off worse in that one. But okay, so 9 years at Let Alliance, and you've obviously done the job of selling insurance yourself, but you're now focused more on the customer, the corporate customer relations type side of things. Okay. So yes, obviously you work for Belvoir, or work with Belvoir rather, but I'm going to approach this as if I am a landlord and I know absolutely nothing about insurance, which is quite handy because it is one of those subjects that generally I glaze over with slightly, I have to say. But so as a landlord, if I was to, let's start with, why do I want landlord insurance? Why would I need it? What is it?
Yeah, okay. So we'll kind of address all of those in one big package, I suppose. So it's unlike car insurance where you have to have it. Unless your mortgage provider stipulates that you have to have insurance, it's up to you, okay? So fundamentally, a lot of people think that landlords, builders and contents insurance is the same sort of insurance as their own home. Mm-hmm. There's a few key things that are very, very similar. So it will cover against fire, flood, storm, theft, those sorts of elements, like the big sort of catastrophes. Mm-hmm. But one is designed for you as a homeowner. The other is designed for you owning the property but putting tenants in. So there's things like accidental damage caused by the tenant, malicious damage. You've got loss of rent or reaccommodation due to a buildings claim. So hypothetically, there was a burst water pipe. You, as a landlord, would be liable to reaccommodate your tenant while you're fixing the issue, to pay that out of your own pocket if your policy doesn't cover it. Or the tenant stays in the property but doesn't pay you any rent because obviously the contract that you guys have signed as a tenant and a landlord has been breached. because you said you'd given a nice, safe property. That's not happening at the moment. So you would lose out financially if your tenant basically withheld the rent. Okay. So our policies and policies on the market can and do cover those sorts of events. So they are two different elements. And if you have got a standard buildings insurance policy and you have an incident and they find out that actually it's a tenanted property, that policy is going to be more likely going to be void, and you wouldn't get a payout even if you've paid your premiums for the last 10 years.
That sounds like an expensive mistake. Yes.
It is. So it is crucial to spend 10, 15 minutes just making sure that it is correct and it does cover your needs, because life changes, scenarios change. The policy you took 2-3 years ago might not cover you for what it does now, so on and so forth. So it's always good to review at your renewal date.
Okay, so if I've been living in a property and I then rent it out, it's going to be, so it would have been just for a home owner occupier. I then would need to get landlord insurance to cover that instead rather than this. What's the sort of thing if I have a flat and it's covered by the block insurance? Would that generally cover me for that sort of thing?
So flat insurance, yes. So if you're a leaseholder, all the leaseholders are normally paying a ground rent or a service charge to the freeholder to cover the actual bricks and mortar. However, depending on your lease, so again, it's really important to check this, policies don't cover things like kitchens and bathrooms, like carpets, curtains, or any contents that you as a landlord has within that flat. So it will cover the whole building as the structural element, but not individual units. So we can have a very small policy that will cover the kitchens and bathrooms and any contents that the landlord may have there, like I said, blinds, white goods, carpets, along with public liability cover. That's if your tenant tries to sue you for negligence. So you don't need to worry about the bricks and mortar, but you do need to still worry about your own possessions within that flat.
Okay. So, because normally you would have buildings insurance and then you would have contents insurance separately. So your policy is basically both of those, is it, to start with? The main policy, and then you can have a bolt-on that is the contents?
Yeah, so our main policy is buildings. Okay. You can have buildings and contents, but for flats, for leasehold flats, it's just a contents-only policy because the freeholder would normally look after the actual structure of the building.
Okay. So if I'm a landlord and I have, I've got an unfurnished property, but I do have a fridge, freezer, cooker, washing machine, I've got blinds, carpets. Do I need to have contents insurance, or am I okay with just buildings insurance?
You don't need to have contents insurance. No, it's completely up to you. We can add it on, we can take it off. So the actual buildings insurance is going to be the primary kind of element for a freeholder of a standard building. And if they did want to cover any contents, we can do that up to £50,000, but you don't have to have it if you don't want to. Some people literally are upping and leaving the country for work purposes for 6 to 12 months. So they want to protect their possessions because they'll be moving back. Other people, it is an investment and there's literally nothing other than a couple of £100 worth of carpets. And they just think, well, actually, when their lifespan's done, I'll just replace them. So it all depends on what specific needs that landlord has.
Okay. Yeah, because that was one of the things that I've heard a long time ago with buildings insurance was somebody said to me, basically, you take the property, you turn it upside down, and anything that would move is contents, whereas anything that stays put is covered by buildings. So if you have built-in appliances, are they covered by buildings, or are they... Am I going into too much detail here? Sorry.
No. It's good question. Okay. You're absolutely right. So if it's a built-in like oven or a hob, so you can get the hobs now that are really, really trendy and they're like kind of sunken in, that would be classed under buildings, because you wouldn't take it out to move. If you were to move the property, like move your house, sorry, let's try again. If you were to move house, not move your house, then you wouldn't take that with you. However, if you've got a freestanding cooker with a hob on top, you basically just slide that out. It's just plugged in, isn't it? Most of the time. So that would be classed as contents because you would more likely take that with you. Like white goods, like fridges and freezers, they're all classed as freestanding. So I appreciate some of them might be built in, but actually it's just a fascia. So you can take that off and then you slide your your appliance out, same as dishwashers and washing machines.
Yeah.
So they'd be all classed as contents.
Okay. And given that in rental properties, those sorts of things tend to have a lifespan of like 5 to 8 years or something, you have to kind of think, is it worth paying for that insurance separately, or just budget for the fact that you're going to have to replace it in 5 years' time?
Yeah. It's all depending on the values as well. So like the minimum we do is £2,500, but it doesn't really affect the premium in a great deal at all. Maybe a couple of quid, if that. Or, so some people might think, well, actually it is worth it because then I don't have to worry about it. Other people might have gone, well, actually it's 5 years old anyway, let's just forget it. Other people might have just done a brand new renovation and they think, actually, I do want to protect it. Everyone's different. So that's where our team are very, very strong in being able to support the landlord, understand what the policy would be covering.
Okay. That's all. I'm just thinking in relation to whenever I buy, so like just before we started talking, my car insurance popped up as a reminder. Now, I would normally go on to one of the comparison sites and just say, here's my car. This is where I park it. This is what I use it for. And I get half a dozen different quotes come in. Everything you're saying there about the values and that kind of thing makes me think that this is quite difficult to do that kind of comparison on.
Correct. Yeah, it is, because everyone does relate it to car insurance because I think that's most familiar for everybody. It's not, because each policy is completely different to things out there. And until you start reading the fine print, you only kind of get involved in that. So one of the best things about our policy is it'll give a blanket level of cover. So what that really means to any landlord is that as long as the property is going to cost between £0 and £500,000 to rebuild it, they're covered. Simple as that. Whereas other policies out there, and I don't want to name any with a red phone that goes flying down the road, they will ask you to give a rebuild value. I'm not a structural engineer. I wouldn't have a clue how much it's going to cost to rebuild a property. So you're almost having an educated guess, but that guess might be slightly wrong because with inflation just under 10% now, if you've had that policy for a number of years, you could find yourself actually underinsured through no fault of your own, other than the fact that the building materials have increased. However, the insurer will turn around and say, well, actually, it's your responsibility to make sure that you are adequately insured. So you could be on the hook to find extra cash because you just basically automatically renewed it and you just assumed that was the right figure. Whereas ours, as long as it's in that sort of bracket between 0 and £500,000, which 99% of the properties are, you're absolutely fine. So you don't need to worry about underinsurance or overinsurance. We've got you covered, basically.
That's actually really interesting. Yeah, because I mean, one of the things that I thought originally when somebody said 500,000, or when you said 500,000 to me, I was thinking, oh, well, 500,000, actually, there's a lot of properties around here that are considerably more than 500,000, but it is the rebuild cost rather than the actual sale price of your property. So it's going to be much less than the actual sale price. But then no, go on.
I was going to say maybe about 10, 15 years ago, they were kind of roughly on par, but now, obviously you saw that housing boom 12 months ago. It's slightly coming back down now. But you've got desirability factors and obviously land factors. So you're paying for the plot, you're paying for the location, you're paying for the amenities. That is all taken out of the factor. We are literally just talking about bricks and mortar and the building costs involved in rebuilding that property. So most of the times it's going to fall in that 500 grand, even if it's going to cost you 750, 800,000 pounds to buy it. We're talking solely rebuild value. Okay.
In terms of that, because yes, I was wondering about that, the accuracy of the rebuild. So I'm really pleased by the, between 0 and 500,000, because I remember looking at something in terms of blocks previously and being told that if the rebuild hadn't been valued in the last, I think it was 3 years, that if, for example, the rebuild value was $1 million, but you were only insured for 500,000, that you would get
only get 50% of any claim that you made. So if you did need to rebuild, you wouldn't just not get 500,000, you would get 250,000 because they would halve it again or something along those lines. So that's quite important then. So if I am a landlord and I have, let's say flat in, no, let's say, so I've got a house, I've got a terrace house and I have a fire and it destroys not just my house, but the houses next door or either side. If I have undervalued my rebuild by 50%, that could mean that if I have to rebuild my house and the two houses next door, I only get 50% of each of those, of that money back from the insurance, potentially. So what would I do? What do I check for in my insurance policy to make sure that that's not a factor?
Well, so in that prime example, there is it's something called an ABI link. So it's associated with British insurers, which is a free link to use. You just register your email address and it'll give you 5 free attempts. After that, you have to pay for them. It'll ask you some questions about your property, and then it'll give you 3 different rebuild values. So you'll have low spec, medium spec, and a high specification. All depending on the answers you give, it'll give a rough rebuild cost. Okay, so I know our policy covers up to the 500,000, so you don't have to worry about that. But obviously, for this, and obviously any of your landlords that are thinking, well, actually, even if it's mid-term and my policy is not due for renewal, it's worth checking that actually where I am right now is accurate. So I'll share the link with you afterwards, so you can put it within the podcast. So if anyone's kind of mid their policy at the moment and wants to just double check, then obviously please use that.
I think that'd be brilliant. I actually hadn't realised there was anything like that. So that's an ABI link, you say, right? Okay,
because I was associated with British insurers.
Okay. I was thinking that you'd need to have, you only really find out that information when you remortgage or you get a survey or you get your original mortgage. So yeah, if I can do that, that's great. Thank you. Okay. So in addition to that, you mentioned earlier on about accidental damage and malicious damage. Are they covered in standard landlord insurance, or is that specific to Let Alliance? Or
again, it's so specific. Well, it's so tricky because I know Direct Line's policy, you have to add it on. Others will have it included. Let Alliance's policy has accidental damage as standard, all the way up to £500,000.
Okay.
We can also add malicious damage caused by the tenant, up to that £500,000 as well. There is a slight premium change, obviously because the risk is different, but on average it's about £20 a year, £25 a year to add that on. Whereas a lot of our claims, or a good chunk of our claims, are malicious damage rather than accidental damage. And it will also cover things like drug dens. We've had some in the past, which I'm working on the figures at the moment. There's an agent in, let's just say South Wales, who had a £264,000 claim due to a drug den. So our policies will cover that, and without kind of just dodging the question so much, I wouldn't be able to answer it depending on the policy that your landlords currently have. Okay, some I have seen in the past that do cover malicious damage. The excesses on them are £1,000, and they'll only cover up to £10,000 or up to £5,000 per claim. So in theory, when you're looking at, say, Go Compare or whatever, there's a little tick in the malicious damage box. But when you dive into the policy, I've never come across a tenant that says, right, we're at 4,900 quid's worth of damage, let's stop now. They just keep going. So
wow, that's interesting. So you can take out landlord insurance and not tick that malicious damage thing, and then you get no cover for this at all. Okay. No. If I was... So let's say I'm a bit reckless when I let my property out and I don't do any kind of referencing checks or anything like that. Does that impact? Because everyone, I don't know, I'm a little bit suspicious, but people always think there's some small print somewhere, there's some way out of this stuff being paid. So it seems to me that if somebody hadn't referenced their tenants at all, they would be more likely to have someone who would create a drug den or what have you. So I'm just thinking the risks of malicious damage are then that much greater. Is there any kind of double checking back on that kind of thing? Is there any small print that says, well, you didn't reference your tenants or they didn't reference cleanly or anything like that?
Not in buildings insurance, no. So regardless if you've referenced with us or if you haven't, we'll still insure the property. So even if you've got a friend that self-manages, we'll still be able to cover the buildings insurance. It's taken as an overall risk. So without getting really technical and really boring, because we're probably 18 minutes in and people have probably had enough by now, the way that the insurers rate areas is via postcodes. So they use loads of different data, so crime rates, they use flood risk postcode. They also use a database that has claims information on it. So they share which areas have the most amount of claims. So they rate them in certain areas. So it's nothing to do with the referencing process. It doesn't affect it if you've had an unacceptable tenant and you decide to put them in. As long as you've got the adequate cover, and say, right, I want malicious damage on this, I want accidental damage as standard, then I want to cover my contents. If there's a problem, we will still pay out.
Okay.
So it's not linked to the referencing the same way that the rent guarantee is.
Okay. All right. That's not what I was expecting at all. So, okay. So it's dependent on the area as much as anything else and the amount of claims and stuff in that area. Okay. Now, when we were talking earlier on, you were saying about, I think we were talking about the cost of insurance and whether there are any tenant types or types of tenancy even that you don't cover. Can you just recap on that a bit for me?
Absolutely, yeah. So we spoke about other providers that don't offer cover to certain types of tenants. And that's their business model. They've decided, I don't want to offer cover for X, Y, and Z, and that's up to them. We will cover pretty much anything, okay? So if it's an asylum seeker, DSS, a professional person, then pretty much the range is pretty much everything you're going to come across. As with everything, risk is taken into consideration. So premiums might be slightly affected, depending on what sort of tenant type you go with, just because, like I said, with the risk. However, you're not going to be in the position that you have to say no to a specific tenant just because your insurance won't provide cover for you. We will.
Okay. Because that was quite an interesting one, because we had... there was a landlord that we took on a couple of years ago now, and he had previously had a guaranteed rent tenancy, and there had been a flood at this property and it had damaged the 2 flats underneath. So it was really quite extensive costs. And I don't think there was any dispute about it being accidental or malicious or anything else, but the dispute was about whether the insurance actually covered guaranteed rent or not. And so there was he had some very nervous times thinking that he was going to have to actually self-insure, basically cover the cost of all of this stuff himself, but hadn't actually realised that his tenancy type was an issue.
Wow.
It's the sort of thing I would probably miss as well, to be honest.
So with that sort of scenario, you said it was a flat, comes up a fair bit, to be honest with you, because you've got to think about what you're claiming for. So most leaseholders are contributing to their buildings insurance to their freeholder. The freeholder can sometimes be quite tricky. We've probably heard it in the news recently about cladding and so on and so forth. But if you're making it, say if there's a water claim, it's, I don't know, come out of the bath and it's literally leaked into the flat below, and you're making a claim on your flat and the one below, you've got to think about what we're claiming for. So if it's structural, so floorboards, electric, plumbing, that would be normally looked after by the freeholder because they are responsible for those items. And if it's contents, what would normally happen is the flat below would claim on their own policy. And in the background, the insurance providers would talk to each other to say, well, actually, it came from you. You're the reason why my client had to make a claim on the policy. and they would sort it out internally away from the client and the kind of customer-facing journey. But in that sort of scenario, there may be multiple claims going on for a flat in the same property, one through the freeholder and one through the leaseholder under the contents. So that's quite common, if I'm going to be completely honest with you, and it is quite common for a freeholder to probably drag their heels or basically tell the landlord, actually, no, you need to make a claim yourself, just because they don't want to bump their premium up because their claims history has now obviously changed. But they're very, very case-by-case elements, and it's really important that for a leasehold landlord, just to double-check that lease agreement to confirm what is covered within their ground rent or service charge payments. And it's always important as well to ask for a copy of the building's insurance, because the leasehold flat owner has a vested interest in that insurance policy to make sure they're going to be covered sufficiently. So again, always ask for a copy so that landlord's got a copy on their records.
Yeah, because that's going to change potentially every year as well. The insurance.
Exactly.
It's going to be different provider and different amounts covered and all that sort of thing. Okay, so
you're absolutely right.
Yeah. When you were saying before about, or when we were saying about malicious damage or even accidental, one thing that's always puzzled me, so, you know, it's not generally the drugs dens or what have you, but there's a certain amount of damage in a property. What's the crossover between deposit and insurance in terms of that damage?
Okay, it all depends. So traditionally, if we're finding someone who's done a fair chunk of malicious damage, they normally haven't paid their last month's rent, which that's what the deposit will cover. Then you've got a couple of weeks left. They'll have done some more damage than that couple of £100's going to actually cover. So that bit rent goes first. So the rent's covered. Then whatever's left will go towards dilapidations and malicious damage. And then that's when the insurance kicks in to cover the remainder. Okay. So see, if your tenant is normally a very good tenant and they've done some damage, they may just simply have their own insurance policy that they'll claim on for tenant liability, or just take their money out of the deposit. The reason why we cover it is to make sure that kind of you insure for the worst case scenario, which is your tenant does a runner owing you 2 months rent and smashed your property up. Your 6 weeks deposit isn't going to scratch it.
No.
So that's why we have that element to cover the malicious damage and accidental damage caused by the tenant. So you know your landlord is going to be put in exactly the same position as if the tenant was a great tenant and just left.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay, so if what are the worst mistakes that you've seen made by landlords then in terms of their insurance? Can you give us some interesting examples of mistakes?
Yeah, so I had a landlord who I think he had about 6 or 7 properties. He self-managed them, and then he joined a letting agent. It wasn't part of the Belvoir group, and he had a policy due for renewal. And one of his other properties actually had a fire. It turned out that all of his insurance policies were standard homeowner policies. So, well, I say luckily, the damage was about £20,000 worth. It was a fair chunk of money, but it wasn't hundreds of thousands.
It could have been much worse, yeah.
It could have. But his policies wouldn't have covered him. And he was just like, I've had these for 10 years. He's been paying all this money for these premiums, and they were never going to cover him. So that was probably a big element. The other elements that I see quite a lot is the way that things are phrased as well. So people may think they've got rent guarantee on a policy, where actually it's called loss of rent, which is what I spoke about earlier, that actually if you need to reaccommodate your tenant or they stay there, that's what it'll cover. So it's kind of digging into it, because let's be honest with you, I think everyone knows like car insurance, and they're pretty much all roughly the same, aren't they, other than your excesses and so on and so forth. But with landlord's insurance and insurance in general, people probably don't dive into it deep enough to understand actually what their policy is going to cover. So it's all well and good having something online and you can click a few buttons and buy a policy, But I tell you what, you'll be ruining the day that you do that if you have a claim and you'll think, well, actually, if I spent 10 minutes speaking to someone and asking the questions I want to know, I would have saved a whole lot of time and money and aggro. So...
yeah, so I can't talk about that rent cover. I can't remember what it was.
Rent guarantee?
No, the rent guarantee, not the rent guarantee, the rent...
the loss of rent.
The loss of rent, yes. That brings back horrific memories to me. Within the first, I think it was almost about 6 months or so of opening my office, I had a call from a tenant on a Sunday morning who just said, "Oh, would you mind talking to this fire officer, please?" And just passing the phone across to a fire officer. I'm like, oh my gosh, where are you? Oh, I'm in Enfield. Okay, how quickly can you be here? 15 minutes. Oh my days. And so it was a fire on a mid-floor flat. And I have never been so terrified in all my life. But talking to the landlord, and the landlord and I both we weren't aware of his insurance. And so we immediately put this tenant up in accommodation. We paid for accommodation for him for nearly a week. And then afterwards, it's like, hang on a minute. Have a look at this properly. No, we're only covered for, you only get back the rent, which was obviously considerably less than the rehousing. So it's like, okay. And he just assumed it covered rehousing. It's like, no, it doesn't. So
absolutely right. You're absolutely right. Sometimes it covers one. Well, obviously they cover one or the other. They can't do both. They can't move out and withhold the rent. However, some policies, like you said, will only cover if the rent is withheld. And without doing the maths, I think the average escape of water claim is 66 days. And if your hotel's 150 quid a day, your rent is, you're going to be in the red quite considerably. Even if your tenant is paying the rent, it's just not going to be cost effective. And that's when the landlord doesn't realise that actually they're going to be liable for that bill.
Yeah, very expensive.
It is, yeah. And obviously, I know we're talking about worst case scenarios all the time, but if it's say £10, £15 extra a year, and you've got that peace of mind that actually, if anything does go wrong, we're linked with you as Belvoir. We've referenced that individual. The policies that you guys are kind of providing and recommending, they have to be of a very good level of cover, because we want to protect you as a brand, you as a business, and your landlords. Whereas other insurance providers, I don't want to sound negative at all, but don't have that association with your landlord the same as we do. Like we meet a couple of times a year. You know exactly who I am. Most of you guys come into the office every now and again. So it's very, very different to just a standard insurance provider.
Yeah, it is. And I'm very conscious that we can't actually sell insurance at all. So that has to come from you. But also, I was very surprised when we were talking, because there are insurance companies that don't cover, for example, benefits. And I remember that from ages ago being the case, but I thought that pretty much everyone covered benefits now. And I don't know if there are other people who are landlords who are thinking, well, yeah, everything is covered, and not actually checking their tenancies at all, checking their insurance policies at all. And I just think the risks from this of not being on top of the detail of your insurance are huge. And yeah, it might be like worst case scenario, but it's talking about hundreds of thousands of pounds, particularly around here in terms of rebuild. It's talking about hundreds of thousands of pounds rather than just, the 20,000 that you mentioned. And even if it was just 20,000, that's a massive chunk of money for people. So
I was going to say, I haven't got 20 grand in the bank just to fork out in a rent to fix something. So
no, exactly.
It's not even just, obviously those big numbers are scary, okay, and they are a headline, but there's lots of claims that we have that are in the, let's be honest with you, with the cost of living crisis, have people got a couple of £1,000 to just go, I'll just pay for that? Probably not. So that's when it's really important, actually, making sure the policy you have both protects you and is going to pay you out is important.
Yeah, when you need it,
So those two things are key. And like I said, you as Belvoir are unable to sell a policy due to the FCA regulations. That's for us to deal with directly with your landlords. But let's be honest, we talk to you guys on a daily basis. the same as your landlord will talk to you as much as we will, really. So to be fair to all of us getting involved in it, we can keep close. And if the worst case scenario happened and the landlord needs to make a claim, as long as they give me consent to talk to you, we can deal with it together. So again, that's another point, that we can deal with it with the landlord's consent on their behalf.
Perfect. That makes things much easier. So if I was to say to you as a summary, what is the one thing that you would like any landlord to take away from this podcast? What would it be?
Check what you've got. The second thing, which is probably the biggest, is it's worth having a quote to seeing what has happened within the market. Things change constantly in insurance. And if you've got a policy and you've been happy with that policy for a couple of years, it might have changed without you noticing. The premium might have jumped up quite a lot. So simply having a quote to see what we can do versus what your current provider does is 10 minutes of your time. Worst case scenario, you stay where you are. Best case scenario, you get a bit of extra cover and save some money. Simple as that. You are not forced into either option, but having a chat with us and one of my colleagues is worth the time. Really is. Because you can ask a human what happens in this scenario, which we all have those questions. You can't ask a robot that, can you?
No, I mean, it's interesting you say that, because if I was going to give one summary, it would be get your insurance policy out and have a proper read through. But insurance policies I've never found the easiest in the world to read. So it's quite useful to phone somebody up and say, what happens if this? And whether you're doing that with your current insurer and then with yourselves or another or what have you, phone up and ask about those specific instances. What would this mean to me if X happened?
Correct.
Because, generally insurance policies are a little bit snooze-like. So,
Sorry. They are, I'll be honest with you. You read through them and you're just thinking, blimey, I need a degree to read this.
Absolutely. They're much like tenancy agreements. Anyway, on that happy note, thank you very much, Simon. Really appreciate your input. And we will put your contact details in the notes, if that's okay, together with the ABI link that you mentioned. We'll do that afterwards as well. But thank you very much. And please, people, don't be too concerned. These are worst case scenarios and they're not the norm, I think. Thank you. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
If you enjoyed this episode, then we'd love your support. Please subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode of the podcast with your friends.
We'd also love to hear from you about any topics you'd particularly like us to discuss. Please send an email to yourlettingsjourney@gmail.com.
Thanks for listening, and see you for the next episode of Your Lettings Journey. Goodbye.
Goodbye.